What's the terrible thing a substitute teacher did? Viewers Edition. Teaching is, in my opinion, already one of the hardest jobs there is, and teachers certainly aren't compensated for all the work that goes into the profession. It's really a career of passion, and there's some really excellent people out there who are worthy of the title, but then there's those who have reached their boiling point and really shouldn't be in the classroom. And substitute teaching has its own challenges on top of teaching, so that's just another layer of complexity. Let's hear what the viewers had to say on this topic. Story 1. I'm still mad about this one. I know I need to move on, but we had this one sub in middle school that was taking over for my algebra class. This sub was well utilized by the school. I'd had him a few times before in other classes, but the teachers at my school were generally great and left easy lesson plans to follow. He wasn't a huge issue. I was already mildly upset at the idea a sub could literally sit on their phone supervising a class and still get paid. But it wasn't a big deal. Fast forward about 6 months, I'm in 8th grade algebra class. For some context, I'm that super smart student at the top of the class who does all of my work, gets high scores, stays really quiet, etc. However, I was running around with a lot of undiagnosed mental issues, and I'd been given my first official diagnosis that year, ADHD, which gave me access to an IEP and accommodations. I was bullied a lot for being generally weird and having panic attacks and breakdowns for reasons I couldn't yet explain. Was eventually diagnosed with autism and EDS. Oops, missed that for 14 to 18 years. But normally I rarely spoke to anyone, except teachers I came to trust. So the sub comes in, distributes our busy work my teacher threw together before calling in sick. I start doing it, not paying much attention to the class, as is my standard. Then things get loud. This always overwhelms me anyways. Then the sub keeps asking really personal, borderline intimate questions to some of the 13 to 14-year-old boys in my class. It made me uncomfortable. But teens are teens and like that stuff, so I tried to get it off my mind. Until one of the students drops a piece of his food. We are allowed to eat in class. The student bends down to pick it up and throw it away, but this sub intervenes. He makes the student get down on his hands and knees and eat the food off the disgusting classroom floor like a dog. This poor guy is so embarrassed, but the sub's the type known to send people to the office for even talking back to him. So he complies. At this point, the class gets so loud and everyone is laughing. He's making jokes and making other students do similar things, like he basically owned them. He also said some really sexist BS that I've forgotten with time, and then he started picking on me because I was the only one actually doing the work, asking why I wasn't laughing too. At first, I was mortified, but I played along with it. After a few seconds, I started talking back. I told him he shouldn't be treating students like dogs and making them do things that made them uncomfortable and embarrassed. This was mostly calm, but it was when he said stuff back about it being a joke and me taking things too seriously, being too sensitive and a buzzkill, I snapped. I was getting upset and was already overwhelmed, and I asked to go to the office to sit with a social worker to cool off. I was becoming increasingly afraid he'd make fun of my odd self further or ask me intimate stuff. He denied my request, told me to sit down and do my work because it was fine. I actually started yelling at him, starting to panic, but mostly just extremely angry with him. I told him my IEP allowed me to be excused from class whenever I was breaking down. I know my math teacher left him a basic overview of my accommodations, which he didn't read. Usually I have silent breakdowns and signal to the teacher that I need to go, and they don't make any deal of it. I also said something to the effect of how not everything's a joke to everyone, and how insensitive towards me he was being, as well as if he even read my teacher's notes. He wrote me up for disrespect. I stormed to the office and ranted to the counselor about it. I never got in trouble, but my complaint wasn't taken seriously either. I did, however, manage to scare my classmates and him. It was the first time I'd even snapped that violently, and to them, it was completely unexpected. The administration never took me seriously to my face, but after him doing something less severe and similar in another class the next year, all while constantly looking at me because he remembered how I'd blown up at him, I ended up making another report to the counselor's office the next day after an unrelated breakdown. I was there daily because of gym class. Fast forward a few months, I'm now in 10th grade, talking to my choir teacher after she'd been out and had a sub sit and play on her phone the entire class instead of running through our music with us. She was upset about this, and I got to talking about my algebra sub. Without missing a beat, she looks me in the eye and says, "Mr. Walker's a nice guy, but he's not allowed to sub here anymore." I almost laughed. Apparently there had been other complaints. It was the end of the day, and I went outside and spent the car ride home laughing about it to my mom. Story 2. So, I had very poor penmanship as a kid, and my OCD made me organize my math assignments in a very particular way that doesn't make a lot of sense if you aren't familiar with my system. My 5th grade math teacher, who was teaching 7th grade math because I was in the very advanced group who tested 2 years ahead of the curve, was an awesome teacher, and he had no problem grading my assignments. One day he was out sick, and the sub was this elderly woman who had been a school teacher for 50 years and had been retired for 20 during the math period. Her entire job was to collect the homework assignments so the teacher could grade them later and give us worksheets to do. When she was collecting the assignments, she refused to accept mine because it was illegible, unintelligible, and a disgrace, and I would have to do it over more neatly. I was worried about losing my perfect grade in math over missing an assignment I had actually done, and because I had severe anger issues, I blew up on her and got sent to the office. Somehow the admins at the office didn't manage to get the message to the teacher that the reason I blew up was because the sub wouldn't accept my homework assignment. So when the regular teacher got back, he was wondering why the sub note said I was sent to the office for refusing to do my work and why my homework assignment wasn't collected with everyone else. I told him I didn't refuse anything. She refused to accept my assignment because she was incapable of reading it. Never mind the fact that it was absolutely not her job to even try grading the assignments, and as such it totally did not matter one bit whether she felt it was acceptable. He told me he'd go ahead and accept it, then at no penalty, since he agreed the sub was unreasonable, so I checked my desk where I had stuffed it before going to the office, and it was nowhere to be found. Apparently she had taken the paper from my desk and thrown it away while I was in the office. Thankfully, the teacher was cool about it and told me he'd just assume I got 100%, like I always did, so it didn't affect my grade at all. But man, was that a crappy experience. Later on in high school, there was a sub who was a self-proclaimed hippie. She was born in the 80s, by which she of course meant a burnout stoner. Now, I have no problem with people who indulge in recreational drugs. In fact, I believe we'd all be better off if most or all recreational drugs got legalized, regulated, and taxed like alcohol. And as an adult, I regularly hang out with stoners and consider them some of my closest friends. But I have no interest in using any mind-affecting substances that weren't prescribed to me by a doctor. As I mentioned in the last story, I have a number of neurological disorders that required me to be heavily medicated, so I can almost pretend to be sane. As I like to say for most of my childhood, now I have enough control that I've been successfully off my meds with no incidents that the meds would have been able to stop for somewhere around 6 or 7 years. My meds weren't harmful the way a lot of kids wound up with. They legitimately helped me stay calmer, more focused, etc. I wasn't a zombie or experiencing any negative side effects. Because of all this, I'm leery of even currently legal drugs like alcohol, so I've never even touched this stuff. I just don't understand the appeal of losing control when I spent my whole life getting control and forcibly lowering my inhibitions when I had to consciously construct them in the first place, since I totally lack embarrassment and genuinely don't comprehend why people are averse to discussing certain topics in public. Basically, even without my meds, recreational substances are unappealing at best, and outright dangerous at worst. With my meds, the idea was so much worse, because then I'd also have to deal with potential interactions. Anyway, all that context is very relevant because when I brought up my disorders and meds with this stoner teacher, she had the gall to suggest I'd be better off going off my meds because they are poison and smoking weed instead. Now bear in mind this was before marijuana was even decriminalized on a federal level, and it's still pretty far from legal in my state almost a decade later, so she was suggesting I ignore the advice of my doctor and commit a crime. I was very unhappy with that. Story 3. Fun fact, I used to have a messed up blood cell in my nose, causing me to have frequent nosebleeds. I have a couple stories, but I'll just share 3 for now. Number 1, I was in 5th grade and I got a bloody nose. I walked up to my reading teacher, who was awful and everyone hated, and asked her to use the restroom. As there was blood dripping from the hand directly on my nose to the hand beneath it, she asked me, "What for? It's only like 10 minutes until the bathroom break." I just removed my hand from in front of my nose and showed her that it was completely drenched in blood, then told her my nose was bleeding. She then went, "Well, I guess you can go." Like, what kind of teacher sees a kid bleeding and hesitates to let them go to the bathroom? Okay, now story number 2. I was also in 5th grade for this one, but it was the very last day of school. We were literally going to the place where the graduation was in about 20 minutes or something, so everyone was all dressed up and we were playing games and having a good time. A couple other kids and I were playing a game at a table, and we were all standing up around it. I don't remember what game. The kid next to me won, or scored a point or something, so he threw up his hands in victory. His hands kind of went up and out, smacking me right in the nose. My nose starts bleeding, and he looks over at me and just says, "Oops." He said, "Oops," then turned back to the game. Obviously, I go and grab my friend with my non-bloody hand and walk up to the teacher. As I said before, I used to get very frequent nosebleeds, so as soon as she saw me bending over with my hand over my nose, she was just like, "Oh, go to the bathroom, sweetie, and get cleaned up." She was my favorite teacher. Now for the final story, number 3. I was laying in bed sometime late at night. I was probably in 5th grade in this one too, and suddenly I got that warm feeling in my nose. I was all too familiar with that feeling. For those of you who don't know, it basically feels like warm, thick snot, and immediately jumped out of bed to go to the bathroom. I was squatting on the bathroom counter, blood all over my face, hands, sink, and bloody tissues all around me. This one was a lot bigger than usual. Coincidentally, my older brother needed to pee, so he walked in on that bloody scene in the middle of the night with the lights out. He flicked the lights on, and I was just kind of staring at him. What was I supposed to say? Sorry? So he was just like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Bro, this happens to me weekly. Where have you been?" And he was like, "Okay," and went back to bed. Funny enough, the next morning I walked downstairs to him telling my mom about this crazy dream he had last night. I was like, "Oh yeah, I had that one too." And he put the pieces together pretty quick after that. Whoa, this is like really, really long. That's kind of crazy. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this roller coaster of bloody noses in my early years. I myself have never had a bloody nose, nor have I ever really broken a bone. I guess I'm not very accident prone. But it sounds to me like this kid has had more bloody noses than a Japanese schoolboy in an anime about cute girls. I always get a kick out of those tropes in animes because it's a very visceral response and so prominent in most of the shows of this type, but surely it doesn't happen in real life. It's just a creative, funny way to express teenage arousal. Story 4. It was 5th grade and I was excited because I had the best teacher in the school, known for her field trips, good taste in books, and being super carefree. The first day she wasn't there, the whole year she wasn't there other than one day, we had a sub, Mr. Joel, who was a jerk. He made us do nothing but listen and take tests, no real work to see if we understood anything, but what's worse was if anyone sneezed or had some other sign of allergies at any point in the day, everyone heads down in silence and lights off for 10 minutes. I hated that teacher, and unfortunately, I got him twice in a row, so I had a redo of that last torturous year again under the assumption I was in her class, which in the end, she moved school boards at the beginning of the dang year. Then in the 3rd and final year of him working, he was giggly, jokey, and twitchy, and halfway in, just gone. Rumor had it that he was on drugs of some sort, and he got caught. In all honesty, whenever we had no sub and would be divided, all students would do all in their power to not go to his class. One day, me and my friend were the bad picks, year 3, about 2 to 3 weeks before he left, and he was ignoring the kids and was just giggling at his desk, even hugged me and my friend on the way in. He was never friendly, so child me was convinced he was high or possessed, and he barely even spoke to the class, just gave them word puzzles and math easy learning sheets that were barely grade appropriate. As we later found out, he never worked in any form of school in the area. Whatever happened to him, I don't care. I hated him so much, and still do, for taking away outdoor times and making me stuck with hyper idiots. The only other that was worse was the lunchroom monitors, which I had taken vengeance on in kindergarten. I was at a different school than 1st through 8th, and at that other school we had lunchroom monitors. They hated us calling them, so they took outdoor time from us and made us stay inside to learn their names. As revenge, I ignored them and only listened if they referred to themselves as lunchroom monitors. The blonde one even gave me a black eye for asking a question, something along the lines of, "Why are you so tall?" As well as I was barely not a toddler, and she got mad and hit me. Her entire career was done after, for obvious reasons. My mom still hates that woman's guts to this day. Story 5. Another sub-teacher story I have was a year prior in history, I think. The layout of the years at the school is confusing, even now. We had a different teacher and a different sub, but it was still chaotic. I sat on the table for people who needed extra help for multiple reasons. Dyslexic, English not being the first language, autism, ADHD, etc. And the kid I sat next to wanted me to dare him to shout the Ensler, him being white. Of course, I told him no, as why would someone say a horrible word? And no, he was aware of how hurtful that word is. This was year 8, 7th grade. Either way, of him telling him no, and that's disgusting, he shouted it anyway and giggled like a girl with her friends looking over at a guy who she found cute. I glared at him and shouted, and I got yelled at instead by the sub. Also weird as the sub was black, so if anything, I thought he would be happy with my actions. Me and this kid continued to argue, and the girl who sat on the other side of me was confused on what the word was. I whispered it to her and what it means. She's also black, and she stood up with me. This kid left the class in anger, and I got detention for disturbing the class. Extra, a teacher on patrol got involved and asked me about what happened. I was calm when I told her, and it made the boy angrier, and it turns out he told the patrol teacher, said the Ensler, then changed the story to I told him to say it. I had the girl on my table and a guy from my class who heard everything across the room. I, in fact, didn't get in trouble, but the sub-teacher still hated me the rest of my time in that school. Story 6. In my freshman year of high school, my English teacher was pretty visibly pregnant at the beginning of the year. When she was on leave partway through the year to have the baby, we had one particular sub for an extended period of it. This sub was the worst. She was one of those "the bell doesn't dismiss you" types, and on top of that, we were meant to be doing a paper. She was meant to be in the computer lab for us to work on these projects. We were meant to be there for the full class period, and 3 students at a time were meant to be going to the library for book research, and had to have at least one physical book as a source. Well, the second day she was taking over, we had an alternating schedule, one set of classes one day and another set the next. We were all stood outside a locked computer lab until the teacher across the hall from the lab came out and sent us to the classroom. This woman was just sitting in the class, just seething. Marked us all out. Every day from then on, she made us go to the classroom, sit for the bell, take attendance, leave our stuff in the classroom, and then make the walk to the computer lab. Then about 15 plus minutes before bell, we went back to class for our things, and then she had the audacity to hold us after bell and cut into the 5 minutes we had to go to lockers, bathroom, and get across a campus that had 2 buildings with 2 floors each. Enough people were late coming from the same class that other teachers complained about it. The next week rolled through with her still doing this until she was apparently not there that Friday. We had a different sub every couple days throughout that teacher's maternity leave, all much less annoying ones. This lady must have a power-tripping issue. It's one thing to be a stickler for rules, but if they already had a process down, there was absolutely no need to mess with it. Clearly, she just wanted to inject her own power dynamics into the class. Story 7. A friend told me about a story he read on the internet where a sub ripped out a kid's insulin pump because they thought it was headphones. So the kid stood up and went to leave the classroom. The teacher asked him where he was going, and he said, "To do something fun, since I only have about 1 freaking hour left to live." In reality, he went to the office, where they contacted his mom, and she was able to get a new pump for him in about 10 minutes. The sub was fired, and I think they might have gotten sued for destroying the pump. The tube ripped, and endangering the student's life. One of my personal stories is that I had a sexist English teacher that only ended up giving any guys something above a C because If she didn't, then she would receive tons of backlash from sports teams coaches. If we played Kahoot and the guys were scoring better than the girls halfway through the game, would not be okay to play anymore, and we would have to study for the rest of the period. The only fun part of her class was when someone was playing animal noises on their iPads, and all the guys had to go and spend the rest of the time in the hall. Little did she know, someone had a soccer ball in their bag, and we spent the next 10 minutes kicking that around before the vice principal found us. We explained the situation, we were sent back inside, and she was pulled out of the room to have a conversation with the VP. She came back in 5 minutes later, angry and red in the face. For a bit of clarification, this happened in the first 15 minutes of class, and the animal noise was made a few seconds before the bell rang. Story 8. One day we had a substitute for my engineering class. We've had the sub before, and I thought she was good. She had a sense of humor, though a bit corny, and it brought a bit more joy in the day. She does keep the jokes and riddles going a bit longer than should, but still not bad. It was a small class, but of course, one of the girls in the class was the overly entitled one. She made good grades, though. I truly don't know how, but that's a separate story. She was also manipulative and didn't really care what she said to people. One day, this sub covered for the teacher. I was excited as I liked her jokes and riddles. Class started off as it normally would, and she said her joke before we went to the computers to work on our projects. She does, however, take people a bit too seriously at times when she isn't telling one of her jokes. When we all went to work on our projects, the girl asked, or yelled rather, "How do you wipe, front to back or back to front?" How or why the sub didn't shut down the question is beyond me. Instead, she proceeded to answer her question on how it should be done due to health reasons. I wasn't paying attention. The next day, all the kids in the class, except me, complained about the sub for answering the girls' questions. They said that she just started out of the blue and randomly talked about it for no reason. Needless to say, we didn't see her again. Story 9. I have autism, struggled a lot with early high school, and have had a lot of support in education over the years. One of my idiosyncrasies is that I have very sensitive hearing and would deal terribly with the rambunctious nature of a young classroom. I basically wanted to learn, was very quiet, interested in my subjects, and couldn't tolerate the BS of my immature classmates. Most substituted lessons resulted in my class being completely uncontrollable to the point where I had to leave the classroom in order to get work done, which I was allowed and trusted to do. It became such a repeatable scenario of incompetent subs, which were cycled, that eventually I made it a rule that if the class was subbed, I would simply collect the set work and leave. And if they refused to give it to me, I would leave anyway. I wasn't friends with any of my classmates at this point, but I knew them better than any substitute. I could sense the storm approaching. The dumbest thing I can remember a science substitute telling us was in chemistry when the substitute insisted that the gas we were smelling did not smell like rotten eggs. The gas was hydrogen sulfide, H2S, in tiny amounts, which has a distinct rotten egg odor and is well documented. Our actual teacher was completely dumbfounded by this when she got back. Story 10. I had a substitute teacher during my freshman year in history class. We had a quiz. The sub posted a sheet with the names of each student with how each student did in front of the entire class. The entire class was in an uproar due to the violation of privacy of the grades. I remember when I was a kid, I tried to be a nice kid to the subs, since I thought they were stressed. One sub looked so tired, so I made an origami flower for her and gave it to her. She clenched her jaw, nodded, and thanked me. And after class, since I was nosy and hated playing outside, I snuck back into the classroom and found her crying. She was crying and tried to avoid telling me why, but eventually with my prying, I was in like 3rd or 4th grade, I didn't know better, she told me. Turns out her kid was in the hospital and she was very stressed. I made her a second flower to give to her kid. She felt bad about venting to a kid, but I didn't say a word to the regular teacher or anyone else. Miss Jeffersons, I hope you and your loved ones are well, including Ken. Story 11. One sub racially profiled a black kid in my 8th grade English class. For context, she was a middle-aged white woman who clearly never had experience with rowdy middle schoolers. She tried her best, but dang, she was snappy. During the class, 2 boys were messing around, both were white, and flinging those eraser caps you put on pencils at each other. One nearly hit me as I was between them, and I moved spots to be near my friends in the class after she lightly scolded them and allowed me to switch seats. Eventually, the black kid, he was a very prominent troublemaker who had a history of being loud, obnoxious, and in some cases lewd to girls, was just talking to his friends when the sub snapped at him and had our school's varsity football coach, a large bear of a man you do not cross, escort him to the office. The whole time, all of us were silent and watched as it unfolded. The rest of the hour was awkward and uncomfortable as she tried to act like it never happened. The next day, the main teacher came back and explained that the sub had been terminated from the school. Story 12. I had a substitute teacher talk about that body replaces most cells and tissues every 7 years. I understood him perfectly. However, pretty much the whole class, even the special ed tutor that was hired specifically to explain this stuff to the special needs kids, they all thought he was trying to say was that humans poop out bones every 7 years. I tried to tell my father that day and laugh about it. He was baffled and tried to explain to me the whole 7 years new cells, which I said multiple times that I understood, but no one else did, and that was why I was laughing about it. He still didn't get any of it. For that day, it felt like I was the only person in the world that could use a functional brain, and all other people were running into some cartoon logic. This idea is a core concept in the branch of philosophy called metaphysics. It really gets into the nature of composition and what it means to be classified as any given thing. Like if all the cells that make up our body are cycled out over the course of 7 years or so, then are we still ourselves, or have we become something entirely new? The concept of who we are, or more broadly what any given thing is, seems to transcend the physical makeup of that thing. The most common thought experiment associated with this type of thinking is the ship of Theseus. It raises the question of whether an object that has had all its components replaced remains fundamentally the same object. As is the case with most philosophical questions, there is no definitive answer, but there's sure as heck a lot of solid arguments that span across the spectrum on the debate. Pretty interesting stuff. Good thought experiment. Story 13. Not a teacher, and this is a crazy true story. In 2nd grade, I saw a substitute teacher break a kid's arm in a fit of rage over a watch. The kid had one of those alarm clock watches, and he couldn't figure out how to turn off the alarm, so the alarm went off 2 days in a row, and the teacher had left a note regarding it. So the sub actually knows about the alarm, and that the kid is not trying to be obnoxious, he just didn't know how to turn it off. So the alarm goes off, and so does the teacher. He grabbed the kid by the arm and yanked him out of the chair, breaking his arm. This was way back in the 80s, and yes, the guy was arrested. Story 14. My 6th grade science teacher was known as the strictest teacher in the entire school, in a good way. One day, she had a sub who was supposedly nicer, however, it was clear she did not fit that description. We were working on a project, something about keeping ice cool in a beaker, and a bunch of kids were pretty much goofing off and playing around, so I think she developed the idea that our entire class was rowdy and misbehaved. Eventually, one of the nicest and most honest kids in the class accidentally broke a beaker. The sub was berating that student about how they were playing around and not being focused. That moment broke my trust for subs, and it just shows how much reputation with a teacher matters. Story 15. I went to the help group. It's a school for students with disabilities, and there was a year, I was in maybe grade 4 or 5, we had no proper teacher, just a bunch of subs. Every month or so we would get a new substitute teacher, and none of them were linked with each other, so we were basically taught nothing. To be fair, it wasn't their faults. They were all good subs, but they didn't have anywhere to start from or stop. But they could have at least tried to, or asked what we learned, so we could maybe have some stuff be done. My parents filed a lawsuit, and we won a good amount of time at a very high-quality tutoring place, Lindamood Bell. Story 16. I'm on the autism spectrum, and I had this sub that caused me to have an emotional breakdown. Basically, he was yelling at students for being too loud, and started singling me out when he saw me crying. I attempted to leave the bathroom so I could calm down. He proceeded to yell at me even more, which caused the other students to stand up for me. It got so bad, the VP had to come in to calm everything down. The VP took one look at me and told me to leave. Next period, I got to have a free hour by my awesome science teacher. Though I'll never forget the sub's quote to another student, "I'd rather buy land on Mars than listen to your stupidity." Story 17. This boosted my ego as a current sub-teacher. I follow lesson plans to a T, write a note to the teacher how the day went, give well-behaved kids a shout-out, and tidy and prepare the room for the next day. You gotta take supply teaching seriously. These people are going to be your coworkers, and the principal will know if you're doing a good or bad job when they're looking to hire full-time. Story 18. I got written up by a substitute teacher because I hadn't done any work in that class. I had my hand up the entire hour trying to get his attention because I didn't understand the first question and even tried speaking up, but got told to be quiet and ignored my raised hand. Nothing came of it, but it was infuriating. Still is. Story 19. As a teacher, I've had the reverse. I was subbing a class and was given basically a tiny amount of work to fill a 2-hour class. Ended up basically making up a lesson on the fly, and the kids told me they wanted me to stay as their teacher. Felt so proud and so sad. Please leave your stories in the comments. I'd love to make a video of them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.